Welcome to Chapter 23, Broad Patterns of Evolution. For EFB103, I am Dr. Chris Whips. Let's get started. This chapter touches on a few topics that you've heard a little bit about already, like the fossil record, and that's where we'll start. So the fossil record is this evidence of macroevolution, and macroevolution are those changes beyond the species level. We talked about population level changes and allele frequency. We talked about speciation itself. And then macroevolution are these broader changes over time. And you can go back and review about how fossils are formed, and we'll touch upon a couple of those ideas here in a moment. But it's amazing that this fossil record shows us this great diversity of life that has existed on this planet, a lot of which is no longer extant. It doesn't exist anymore. It's gone extinct. And there have been some pretty amazing changes as well through time, and we'll talk about some of those major changes as well. So fossils come in all kinds of forms. You might immediately think of, say, dinosaur bones as an example of fossils, and that certainly applies, but there are other kinds of fossils as well. Like these plant fossils here, this is more of a typical fossil, compressed between layers of rock. Here is a piece of wood, so petrified wood, that has become stone, turned to stone, basically. Here are dinosaur tracks, so not the actual bones, but tracks left in what would have been mud at one point that have since fossilized. And so there's all kinds of evidence that we can take from different points in time in the fossil record for understanding the diversity of life that has existed on this planet. Now, it's important to recognize that as amazing as the fossil record is, it's not complete, and there are good reasons for that. There are many organisms, think soft-bodied organisms that don't fossilize well, organisms that maybe live in a place that aren't sort of amenable for fossil formation. And so there's potentially a lot of things missing, right? We do discover more and more fossils all the time and start to piece together this picture of evolution of life on the planet Earth here. But there are certainly going to be gaps because of not everything is going to form a fossil. So the things we tend to find, and maybe this is important because we might focus on the dominant taxa that exist on the planet. Those might be the driving forces of what's happening. And so what we find a lot of fossils of are things that live for a long time. The longer something has been around, and I don't mean like an individual age, I'm thinking like a species that may be around for millions of years. The longer something's around, the just more likely it is to become a fossil or fall into the place and die where fossil formation is most likely. Something that's widespread also, right? That makes sense. So a species that is found in a lot of different places is just more likely to uncover it later. And of course, organisms that have those hard body parts or bones versus soft-bodied organisms that don't really leave any, are not likely to leave any trace in the fossil record. And so let's just take an example here of the evolution of the lepidopterans, which are moths and butterflies. And so we can look back at fossils here, here back 40 million years ago or so, oldest fossil butterfly. This is really where we start to see a big radiation of moths and butterflies. So this is number of lepidopteran families. We see that increase, again, based on the fossil record. We see that increase sort of around the same time that we start to see butterflies. Evidence of a proboscis, oldest fossil moth back in the Jurassic period. And we know that these must have originated earlier than that. Again, think of that incompleteness of the fossil record. There are scales, so these would be from the wings or body of lepidopterans. These are pretty tiny, and finding these in the fossil record is an exciting find. So we know these organisms must have existed back 200 million years ago, and then making some projections, the origin of lepidopterans maybe around 250 million years ago. So how do we know that those fossils are 200 million years old, or however we might want to age it? Well, we can determine the relative age of something. If you were just looking at layers of rock, for example, these strata, If something's lower on that layer, unless there's been an inversion, that there would be, the lower it is, the older it is. So you could get a relative age. Well, something down here is older than something up here. But determining an absolute age, that's another challenge. And one of the things that we can do is called radiometric dating. So radiometric dating relies on the decay of a certain isotope of an element from a parent state to the daughter state. And we'll talk about what that looks like here in a couple of examples. And the point is you can measure that, the proportion of each of these things. And so the decay is also, it also follows a consistent pattern. And this is called a half-life. So over a certain amount of time, so this is a unit time, this is going to vary depending on which radioactive isotope we're talking about. But in this amount of time, this time interval 1, half of the parent isotope has decayed to the daughter isotope type. And that's why it's called a half-life. If we take that same unit of time again, half of that has broken down. So you have half of a half, that's a quarter. Now, again, same unit of time, it's broken, half of that is broken down, so now you're down to an eighth, and so on. So it happens in a very predictable way, and because of that, based on what the measurement of the amount of remaining parent isotope, we can work backwards and figure out, well, how many units of time have gone by? Now you try this one, and we'll talk a bit more about carbon in a moment. The half-life of carbon-14, so that's that isotope, is about 5,730 years. All right, so we have a fossil that's 1/16 the normal proportion of carbon-14 to carbon-12. That's our normal, quote-unquote, isotope. How old is that if we've got 1/16 of the carbon-14? All right, so yeah, if we're at 1/16, that means we've gone through like 4 half-lives. So it's just 4 times 5,730. So let's talk a little bit more about radiocarbon dating specifically. This is very useful, particularly within the range of fossils that are up to 75,000 years old. So when you get into millions of years, this isn't so useful, but it's good for things under that age. Now with radiocarbon dating, you're looking at carbon-14 ratios to carbon-12. And here in this little example here, so at the start here, time 0, you think you have the maximum amount of carbon-14. And then over time, let's say 5,730 years, that's the half-life, only 50% of that carbon-14 is remaining. And then another half-life, so just 5,730 years again. Now only 25 is remaining because half of 50% is 25, and so on. Now, why carbon? Why is this so useful? Well, every living thing contains carbon compounds. Carbon is also ubiquitous in the atmosphere, think CO2. And that's important, connecting back to how carbon-14 forms. And then that carbon dioxide is taken up by plants and organisms like us, heterotrophs. We eat plants. And that half-life is really useful for these shorter term, relatively speaking, on a geological scale, dating shorter term type samples that are less than 100,000 years old. All right, so why is this carbon-14 isotope so useful? Well, another really common constituent of the atmosphere is nitrogen. And when nitrogen is bombarded with neutrons in the upper atmosphere, it will form this carbon-14. And so this is also occurring at a constant rate. So approximately the same amount of carbon-14 is in the atmosphere at any given time. And so when plants are taking this up and then we're eating the plants, things that are alive have sort of that base level, that starting point of carbon-14. And it's not until something dies, no longer taking in new carbon-14, that it starts to break down, right, and forming carbon-12. And so that proportion of carbon-14 that's left is contingent upon when that organism died. That's that starting point of decay of carbon-14. So what about samples, fossils that are older than that 100,000 years or 75,000 years that carbon-14 dating is good for? We can use other isotopes and measure the proportions of those. And we would be looking for isotopes that have a much longer half-lives, right? Because that carbon-14 is going to be gone at some point or to minuscule levels before we get back, millions of years that we might be really interested in. And so one example is potassium-argon dating. And here, the half-life of potassium-40, which will break down to argon, that is 1.2 billion years. So that's really useful for these really deep age type samples. Now, what you're seeing in this example here is you have atmospheric argon that's, say, released from this volcano. That just disperses in the atmosphere, and what's trapped in the soil here that will ultimately become these layers of rock is potassium. And then over time, that's trapped down there, and it will break down. So you see some of that potassium converting to argon here. And so the more and more argon you see, the older those rocks are. All right, so here's a question to check out and think through and pick the best answer. All right, so yeah, if we're looking for evidence that Neanderthals did not occupy the same sites at the same time as modern humans, the samples from the Neanderthals would appear much older based on the radiometric dating, this filtered dating where we see very little carbon-14 remaining. All right, so let's think now about geologic time. We have a way of dating things. We're putting our fossils together in layers and thinking about that over time. One of the challenges of thinking about time is human lifespan is so short relative to the amount of time that the Earth has been around and the solar system that it's sometimes hard just to conceptualize this amount of time. So the geologic record is split into 4 eons. Here we see on this table/figure here. And these are marked or separated by major events. And note that the time difference or the time scale here is different for these. For example, the Archean here, there's a gap of 1.5 billion years. It looks kind of narrow. It's just more to do with how we divide up the geologic record, where we have more subdivisions in the Phanerozoic, which we're in now, that's split into eras and periods, and then more recently here, epochs. Now, there's been many major events from an evolutionary biological perspective on the planet Earth. Here are just some examples. So we start the clock here at the origin of the Earth and the oldest rocks in the Hadean eon. Before that, rocks weren't really forming. The Earth is being bombarded constantly by other chunks of rock, and solid rock hasn't really formed at that point. And fascinatingly enough, once you start to see rocks with less than 1 billion years later, we see evidence of the origins of life. And 3.5 billion years ago, the oldest fossils, definitive fossils. So let's look at the timeline that's provided in the textbook here. We can, again, here we have that same timeline here, the Hadean, the Archean, and we can start here at the beginnings of life, so the first eukaryotes, so the first fossil evidence of eukaryotes, which are these microbial mats. So some microbes form these layers upon layers, and these have formed fossils. And they're called stromatolites. And so these are the oldest known fossils that date back to 3.5 billion years ago. And from that point, we know definitively life existed on this planet at that point. It probably existed before that, based on some other evidence, and just the fact that we have this kind of life by 3.5 billion years. So prokaryotes were the dominant forms of life on the planet for a long time. And prokaryotes are the first to start contributing to atmospheric oxygen through photosynthesis. I mean, we're just so used to this idea, oh, the Earth's atmosphere has oxygen in it, but it didn't originally. Oxygen is actually kind of corrosive and potentially damaging to life. Think, oxidizing, like rusting of metal, that kind of thing. So it's probably good that there was low oxygen in the early days of life, but prokaryotes produce oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis. Think back to photosynthesis. You got to take those electrons out of water to plug into your photosystem complexes. What's left over? Some oxygen. So that's what gets released. So there's something called this great oxygenation event, which occurred 2.7 billion years ago. And this was also a real problem for many organisms too. They hadn't lived in a world that had an oxygenated atmosphere. And as a consequence, this led to a big extinction. And so that marks the boundary between the Archean and the Proterozoic. Now, a little bit while later, we start to see the evidence of eukaryotes in the fossil record and the real rise of eukaryotes. And this is about 1.8 billion years ago. And there's a big gap here from when we start to see oxygen in the atmosphere, almost a billion years, to when we start to see eukaryotes. Now think about what eukaryotes are, right? They have a nucleus. Think about that endosymbiotic event with taking up a mitochondria, and that would be a real advantage in a world that has oxygen in the atmosphere, because you can use oxygen as an electron acceptor as part of respiration. And when we look at some more recent chunks of time, we start to see things changing really fast. So within less than 500 million years, or approximately 500 million years, you start to see multicellular eukaryotes in the fossil record. And then actual animals, as we would define them now, so multicellular organisms. Colonization of land happens quickly after that, the origin of the tetrapods, etc. And here, down on the very end, there's a little nugget here. That's the amount of time humans have been around. So we represent a very, very tiny fraction in terms of the time of organisms that have spent on this planet. Now, something your textbook does, and this I think can be useful if you're trying to think about this deep amount of time, is to take that whole geologic scale from the origins of the Earth, the formation of the Earth, to the present day, and put it on a 24-hour clock and kind of conceptualize it that way. And you see here on this clock, you can look at either one of these, where you have prokaryotes being pretty much a dominant form of life for many hours of the day on the clock here. You need to get more than halfway around in terms of the time that the Earth's existed before you start to see eukaryotes. Eventually, in the last few hours, we start to see multicellular organisms, and then actual animals, and then humans. Depending on how we slice this clock here, on this one it says humans appeared less than 0.2 seconds ago. Here, it's approximately a minute ago. It depends on really where you define where humans have actually began. But it's a very, very tiny fraction of this clock and of geologic time. All right, so let's look at some other examples looking at the fossil record here. And specifically, we'll dig into the origins of mammals. So mammals are tetrapods, 4 feet. And they arose from the synapsids. So if we look at this phylogeny here, we see the synapsids, which are a lineage here that include Dimetrodon, which this guy's kind of cool because it really looks like a dinosaur, but this is a non-mammalian synapsid. And there are some important features that we look at in the skulls of mammals, or those non-mammalian synapsids. Well, one is, if we look about 300 million years ago, here's a synapsid example. Their jaws here had multiple bones, and that's something we're going to see change here. And there is a hinge, a single hinge here between the, say, lower jaw and the skull here. The other thing to note is the teeth. We don't tend to see specialized teeth in these early synapsids. but the teeth all have more or less a single morphology to them. The next group here, the therapsids, we go back to our phylogeny. That's the group where we find the mammal lineage here. We start to see specialized teeth, like these canines here. We still see that single hinged bone here. And this lower jaw type bone, these dentary bones, much larger than we saw with the synapsids. And we tend to see that trend continuing with the large dentary bones. In the cynodonts, we have specialized teeth, still have a single hinge there. The later cynodonts have much more complex teeth with different kind of patterns of cusping on those teeth. And this is a key feature here. The jaw is hinged in 2 locations. So if we look, here's the original hinge. That's this green quadrate and articular bone connecting, articular bones in orange. But we see this second connection here as well in the late cynodonts. And then the very late cynodonts, we're getting much closer here. We've lost that original hinge, and the jaw is hinged now on the squamosal bone exclusively. So what happened to the articular and quadrate bones in mammals? Those actually formed the inner ear bones. And so these would have been important for sound transmission, probably even before we get to mammals. So here's a cynodont where we have those distinct bones here. And we can locate the malleus and the incus, which are the hammer and the anvil of the ear bones. That then, where we look now in mammals, they're separate from the jaw, but they're still there, but they're now separated distinctly from the jaw as opposed to being connected to it, which is just fascinating. All right. So for purposes of differentiation, what is the unique feature of the jaw fossils of non-mammalian tetrapods? Right. So if we go back to those synapsids, those jaw bones the jaws are made out of multiple bones. All right, let's talk about plate tectonics and continental drift. Now, plate tectonics, we're thinking about how these plates on the Earth's crust move around, and the continents are on those plates, of course, but it's a little bit different. We're thinking about continental drift. It depends on plate tectonics. But when we think about continental drift, we're focused on how the continents are arranged relative to one another. Obviously, these topics are connected. All right, so there have been 3 times in the Earth's history where these land masses have all come together to form a supercontinent, 1 billion, 600 million, and 250 million years ago, and then later broke apart and then come back together, and so on. And so when we look at a cross-section of the Earth here, here's the inner core, outer core, the mantle. The crust is kind of resting upon that, and that crust can move around. And so this is a very slow process. If we look, here's an example of seafloor spreading. So this is where a new plate the edge of a plate is being formed and pushing outward. Here's an example of a hot spot. Think Hawaii, where you've got volcanoes forming out in the middle of the ocean. And then those plates are being eroded on the other end, so forming over here at this ocean rift. And then here's what's called a subduction zone, where this plate is diving down under this other plate here. And that sometimes results in this kind of volcanism here, because as this plate breaks down, this magma rises to the surface and forms these volcanoes. So these can cause volcanism, earthquakes, etc., where plates interact. So here are the major plates on the Earth. What you see, the blue arrows here, they're showing the direction of movement of the plates. So here from, say, the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, there's that sea floor spreading. So the plates are growing at that point and pushing away from it. These red or orange dots here are showing where there's either heavy earthquake or volcanic activity, and these may be subduction zones, for example, or places where these plates are coming together. And so what are the consequences of that? Well, this is going to influence the distribution of organisms. It may be splitting organisms up, destruction of habitat over time, creation of new habitat. And we can use Pangaea as an interesting example. So Pangaea was the last supercontinent in recent history. It's the most recent supercontinent. Again, these land masses have come together in the past 3 times, and this is the most recent one. And so what we saw when we had this supercontinent on the planet was deeper ocean basins, because basically all the land is in one place here. You lose marine habitat because you have this one coastline, versus if you have a bunch of continents, you have a lot of different coastline. And during the same time, there was much colder and drier climate inland. So because of this single supercontinent. And so that's going to influence the kinds of organisms that can live there, whether it's on land or in the oceans, given the availability of habitat. And so that will influence those species and their distributions. Continents can break apart and come together. An example here is the movement of the Indian subcontinent, which, as you may know, helped form the Himalayan mountains as it's pushed into the Eurasian plate here. But think about this also from the perspective of latitude. So India as a landmass was much further south than it used to be. And then, 71 million years ago, it's down here. It moves toward the equator. So there's going to be a much different climate for those several million years when it's much closer to the equator. And then it gets further north. So organisms that are on this landmass maybe go extinct or adapt to new conditions. So speciation occurs. And then those conditions will change over time. It's a very long time, of course, but it does happen. So these land masses move around, and as a consequence, different conditions occur. Let's take the Indian subcontinent as an example of allopatric speciation. So here's a split of the Indian subcontinent and what will be modern Madagascar here in red. India is in green here. And these two frog species, which are sister groups, so they're related to one another here, they split when these two pieces of land, these land masses, split as well. And so we have evidence of that from their morphology, and the fossil record, also DNA evidence supports this as well. So just a fascinating example there. So if we go like that frog example, we go look at other kinds of fossils as well, we can see those where those historic connections of the continents were. So here's a distribution of this fern in South America, Africa, India, Antarctica, Australia. This at one point had a continuous distribution. We find fossil evidence for it in all these different places now, but all those places now are separate. Same with Africa and South America. That's a more recent split, but we see fossils that occur in both these places, but now, of course, are completely split apart. All right, here's a question. Right, so this continental drift has allowed for speciation and extinctions to occur. And so let's talk about that. If we look at the history of life here, we see some, amazing diversity. We also see there's lots of organisms that don't exist anymore. And so this connects to this idea of both speciation and extinction. And you can see this is a nice figure showing some of the major forms of life and the number of families. One thing you'll see here is number of marine families of organisms. Now, why would we use just marine organisms? Because that's what we have the deepest fossil record of, right? Because before there were land animals, there were marine animals. So we can use that before there were even land animals and then make those relative comparisons of just marine organisms or marine taxa over time. And so we see an increasing number of species over time up to today, but we also see these dips here in the fossil record that mark extinctions. We'll focus on these 5 mass extinction events, often called the Big Five, that have occurred in the last 500 million years. And here we see over 50% of the Earth's species going extinct, based on our fossil evidence, during these mass extinction events. So the red line on this graph is the extinction rate, and you see the rate really climb at these different points of time. These are the Big Five. But I will point out this blue line here as well, which looks like the previous slide, where we also see the number of species increasing over time. Even though we get these dips, we do see still a general trend toward greater diversity of life on the planet. So let's look at each of these species extinction events, and we'll start with the Ordovician Silurian extinction. That's the first one that occurred about 450 million years ago. And I will say, the further back in time we get, the less clear it is exactly what caused these species or extinction events. And if you're really curious about each of these, you can go dig in the literature and you'll find there's some debate about these things. But what we do know is there was a massive ice age and a sea level drop. Now, that's probably what ended up causing a big extinction. But the question there would be, well, what caused that massive ice age? And there are a few ideas. One being that CO2, a lot of CO2 was taken up out of the atmosphere by volcanic rock, and by volcanic rock causing a cooling. That would result in the loss of a bunch of photosynthesizers because there's not enough CO2 in the atmosphere to use, and therefore there's less oxygen produced. So it causes an anoxic type event. Anoxia potentially causing toxins to seep from rocks. Some have proposed a gamma ray burst destroyed the ozone layer. And also plants have been proposed at the origin and evolution of plants have been proposed as causing this extinction. The next one on the list is the Devonian. This one is interesting because it goes on for a very long time. And I will point out, extinctions do take a long time. It's not usually some single punctuated event, usually. And this occurred over 20 million years, kind of pulses of extinction, and maybe had multifactorial causes. There's evidence of volcanism that might have caused rapid cooling. Some have proposed an asteroid strike, although there's no known impact crater. But again, this is a long time ago, so maybe we don't have still evidence of that. And it doesn't quite fit given that this has occurred over 20 million years. Again, back to plants, it's thought maybe that the evolution of vascular plants and the global spread of trees increased weathering and decreased CO2, ultimately causing a cooling on the planet. The next one is called the Great Dying. This is the Permian extinction, and that's that huge spike of extinction here in the middle of this graph. This occurred about 251 million years ago. It does occur over a much shorter span than the previous extinction events that we talked about, and it's associated with the extinction of 96% of marine animal species, a huge extinction. This one, again, a long time ago, so the data are not crystal clear, but there's more and more evidence pointing to intense volcanism in what we now call Siberia in Russia, and we do see some evidence of that. That would cause global warming from the CO2 release from volcanoes. There's also been proposed that massive methane release caused the warming, and then as we know, climate change and global warming. We understand that that's occurring now. It's not just about everything gets warm. What is another thing that's thought to have happened is you have a reduced temperature gradient, so you don't have the cold at the poles and warm at the equator, but you end up with a reduced temperature gradient, and that has big global effects. And then one of those is reduced mixing of the ocean waters, and that would have caused anoxia. Therefore, a lot of marine species go extinct. Now, it's not all bad, as we'll see. When there is a big extinction event, all of a sudden you now have a lot of open niches. So these kinds of extinctions lead to diversification and radiations of other organisms. And where we see after the Permian, we start to see these radiation of, as in a moment, we'll see the reptiles, as well as these mammal-like reptiles. So this is really important when we think about the evolution of mammals. And after the Permian extinction is also when we start to see the first evidence of dinosaurs. And so we're getting into the Triassic period, and we see early in the Triassic these reptile sort of dinosaur-looking creatures. And then in the late Triassic, we start to see organisms that really do look very much like dinosaurs, although they're not the dominant organisms at this point. And then another extinction event occurs. So here we see about 70% of species going extinct, including a lot of therapsids and amphibians. So thinking about, early mammals and vertebrates. This one, again, not totally clear what the cause was based on the evidence that we have, lots of ideas floating around. But this was crucial because it opened the door for those dinosaurs. We see them in the fossil record before that, but it's after this extinction event that we see this radiation of the dinosaurs that dominated the planet for about 135 million years, which is amazing. Now, again, that doesn't mean single species dominated for that long, but dinosaurs collectively as a group were around for a very long time. But dinosaurs saw their end as well. It's about 65 million years ago, where we see that break from the Mesozoic to the Cenozoic. We see another big extinction, mass extinction event. This one, we have pretty good evidence that this was caused by an impact from a meteorite. And we see a layer in rock that it's right about that same time where we find a lot of iridium, which would have originated from this meteorite impact. And the impact itself would have created a lot of dust clouds that completely blanketed the globe and blocked out sunlight and completely disrupting ecosystem processes. And we do know where this occurred. So in the Yucatan Peninsula, there is evidence of this crater that dates to this time. So that's the smoking gun, if you will. All right, so, not everything dies during these extinction events, and it's certainly uneven what lives and what dies. So some of that is by chance. But let's take an example here where we see changes in the types of species that are on the planet following mass extinctions. So you can imagine how ecological communities will be completely disrupted by these mass extinction events. If some component of the community goes extinct, that might cause the extinction of another component of the community. It might open the door for something else. It takes a while for species to recover. And let's look at this example here. So here's predator genera over time. So based on the kind of organism it is, we can tell, okay, this is a predator. And we see over time an increase in the proportion of predators over time. And here, if we look at 252 million years ago, which is our Permian extinction, you see where you have about this amount of predator genera before the Permian. Afterward, you see a big increase in predator genera, and then it stabilizes at a much higher level. So you're seeing changes, wholesale changes in these ecological communities that last for millions and millions of years. And we start to see predator genera increasing even to this day. All right, so which of the following is a biological cause of extinction? All right, given the choices here, the only biological choice here was origin of a new species. And this is very applicable to this next concept, which is this idea that we are in a sixth extinction. And so the evolution of Homo sapiens, human beings, potentially contributing greatly to this sixth extinction. So the question is, well, are we truly in a sixth extinction? It's hard to see, right, with when you're in the middle of something as opposed to looking back. If you look at extinction rate, some estimates put it at 100 to 1,000 times what would be the background rate. If you're interested in reading more about this, there's a link to an article here. Another thing that we see during extinction events, so this is the relative extinction rate over at various times, say over here on the far right, where we see at least 3 of our main extinction events, mass extinction events, occur during warmer times. Now, whether that's just associated with extinctions or whether that is a root cause is certainly a call for concern as we see global temperatures on the planet now increasing, as we are also, wiping out habitat and destroying, causing extinctions ourselves directly. All right, so we'll end this section here and see you in the next one of part 2 of chapter